Okay, we're back in the podcast studio. Look at us, y'all.
We made it. All in white.
Yeah. Oh, white on white.
Katie and I had a conversation about how we semi-match
you're just listening.
today.
And then D-Dub walks in.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, full discretion, it's Tuesday morning.
Right.
Yesterday, I had a meeting run late. We were all scheduled to record. Mm-hmm. And I left everybody. I ghosted everybody.
Right.
I didn't.
You didn't ghost us.
Ahead of time.
We call this podcast all about
You
Katie.
communicated clearly.
So we said, what about Tuesday morning? And so here we are.
Yeah, the inside name of the podcast is all about Katie.
Yeah, tell me more.
All about Katie.
It's all about Katie. That's the next iteration.
Tell us more.
Okay, speaking of podcasts, we've gotten a lot of good feedback from last week. Before we go into this week.
Oh, really?
You're playing innocent. If you haven't listened at that throughout, but particularly at the very end of last week's podcast, our own Dr. Dennis Wiles sings not a hymn, not even a Christian song, just a good old secular.
There's other kind of music.
Folk.
Dan Fogelberg.
Dan Fogelberg.
I could have done Run for the Roses or Leader of the Band, but
and lots
we
of
were
people
talking about what was in our wedding, though.
I know, yeah, and lots of people came up to me, made fun of me for not knowing Dan Fogelberg. And then also, though, apparently some of our staff that will remain unnamed don't even know who people like James Taylor are.
That's right.
So there's a whole genre that we are. Yeah, at least I know James Taylor. But all that to say, if you have more requests or if you enjoyed that, just text us, let us know. Yeah. You always have ways of finding us. This week, I really did find out people who I didn't know listened to the podcast because they wanted to talk about the pastor singing. Isn't that amazing?
And there you have it.
So, subpoint 2. We have been given a request, what if Dr. Dennis Wiles had a podcast, not this one, that was about sports and pastoring?
Yes, I think that would be awesome.
I think there is a niche demographic that would love that.
Yep. We may give that some thought.
But I got to be straight with you. I'm not the co-host of that one. There are others that will sit in our seats. Barry, perhaps.
It'd be fun.
I'm serious.
Like I said, I could do all sports except soccer. I just don't know much about soccer.
Yeah, you'd need to bring in somebody to help with soccer.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. I mean, I appreciate the athleticism of it and all that. It's just not, I don't follow it, so I don't know. I know there's a lot of passion about it. So it's the number one sport around the world. I get it. I've been all over the world. I know. You go mission trips. Everybody plays soccer. All you got to have is a ball.
What about
make your own goal.
About like racing, car racing?
Well,
like
I grew up in Birmingham,
or NASCAR.
so I grew up in the NASCAR.
So you can hang with all that.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So it's really.
I could even stretch to Formula One if I had to, but
it's very popular.
Yeah, but just don't know much about soccer. So that's all good though.
Like and subscribe if you want to see more of that. I don't even know what that means. Okay. Well, we are marching through your preaching on the Exodus and the Exodus story and how that applies to our lives. This past Sunday, a few things that made it notable. One, it was college grad Sunday.
Right.
And we had, in both services, featured our Korean student choir.
Yes.
Which, just love them. We've talked a lot this week about how much we love them and are grateful for them. So I don't know if any of them listen to this podcast.
Yeah.
I would wager they do not. But if
and then all of our college grads. The whole thing was just awesome.
Yeah, it was very sweet. But it was also Michael Glenn's first official Sunday with us. That's right. So that's notable.
We had a lot happening. And we had the Lord's Supper.
We did. I want to ask you about that.
Big day for us, and great day. And the Korean choir, those students are just incredibly talented. And it was interesting, if you were in the first service, when they finished their song, it was just very fascinating to see how many of them just turned and walked off the platform and went back to the orchestra and the choir. Yeah. They serve in our church. Exactly. They're not just here. And so, it's a great group of kids.
And I believe one of them plays the keys in the second service as well. Right. So they're integrated into the life of our church.
They so are.
And they make us better. So we're grateful. Okay. You preached on
Exodus 19 and First Peter 2. But Exodus 19 really, but
you talked about First Peter. So there's lots to talk about there. Can I start us before we really got into this sermon? We observed Lord's Supper.
We did. And
at our church, when you lead Lord's Supper, you say something like, "This is for all people who profess faith in Jesus." You even said Sunday who have been baptized, which I think. So I want to ask you about that. It wasn't until seminary that I learned that some tables are completely open in the sense that anyone can come and take communion.
Right.
There's no qualification for it. And then I also have learned along the way, some tables are very, very closed. Only people who are members of that specific church can come and take it. If you've been at our church for a long time, though, or churches like ours, you probably think that most communion is just for people who follow Jesus, whatever church you're at. Like the last church I went to that's not ours was Redeemer in New York. That might not be right. That feels like too long ago. And we took the Lord's Supper, Ryan and I did, because we're Jesus followers, but in a different denomination, in a different place, but that was fine. So anyway, I wanted to ask you about that, Dr. Wells, the history of it, and maybe some of your theological thoughts on why we have everything else in our, well, I won't even project that. Why do you think that it's okay to have all believers, and why do you think it's only for believers while other things in our service non-believers can participate in? Does that make sense? Okay. That's a broad question.
Well, I will say briefly, the church in which I was raised, we were heavily influenced by what was known as the landmark movement in Baptist history. And it's an incredibly long story, but there was a time when a Baptist preacher named Alexander Campbell began to lead Baptist churches out of the Baptist family into a new denomination that he technically said was not a denomination, and they became known as the Churches of Christ. And in response to that, a lot of Baptists in the South, where this battle was taking place, began to establish what they called landmarks to say, do this right here, and you're still a Baptist church. And our church had been heavily influenced by that movement. And one of the landmarks has to do with communion and communion. Another one has to do with baptism. Also has a theological perspective on the history of Baptists. And so the landmark Baptist tenets, one of them says that Baptists are the only true church. So that was the answer to the Church of Christ movement, if you will. And so that's the church I was raised in. We had a little pamphlet called A Brief History of Baptists, written by our legendary pastor, our Dr. East, if you will, kind of the, the long-term pastor. And it traced the church all the way back to Jesus and John the Baptist.
Okay.
And then we also were given
sometimes known as the Trail of Blood.
That's actually another pamphlet written by J.M. Carroll, which was the Trail of Blood. Same theory, though. In fact, I would say Dr. Tully, who wrote ours, followed the Trail of Blood. So we had both of those little pamphlets. But also one of the tenets was we didn't accept alien immersion. That meant you had to be baptized by a Baptist minister. But when it came to the Lord,
in that church,
not in that church,
Baptist
but just by a Baptist minister. But you also, if you wanted to participate in the Lord's Supper, you had to be a member in good standing of our church. The idea of closed communion.
Tell me about the good standing. So, did they really keep? Was
well,
that an actual?
In the prior to my time, our church practiced church discipline, so they would remove people from fellowship. Yeah. Yes, that wasn't common, but it was practiced.
But good standing really meant something.
Correct.
And that was detailed.
And our pastor, when I was a little boy, would even say something like this. Now, we had successive pastors, but the first one that I remember as a child, he would say something like this: our church is getting ready to receive the elements of the Lord's Supper. If you're a member of our church, you're welcome. If you're not a member of our church, we will ask you to step outside into the foyer, or you can go ahead and make your way to your car. And we would wait for a few minutes. And so the non-members would actually physically leave the building, and then we would have communion. They never called it communion, even though it was called closed communion. We always called it the Lord's Supper. But anyway, so that particular theological belief and practice was rooted in the relationship between Campbell and his movement. And
it's pretty tied to the geographical United States South, the Deep South.
Southern phenomenon, mostly, I would say.
Spread, but...
But that's because that's where the fight was.
Yeah. I think sometimes we forget the denominational patterns in the United States really followed cultural facets of different states, immigration patterns.
They do.
Things like that. So, if you grew up as a Baptist in the North, you would have never probably even heard of landmarkism.
Right. That's exactly right, for the most part. Yeah. And so even when you think about how we've named ourselves, at the 1845 at that convention where we established the Southern Baptist Convention, separating ourselves from our Northern Baptist brothers and sisters, every denomination did that in America.
Right.
That era. But then when the war was over, every denomination in America came back together except one. That was us. So it's kind of fascinating that here we are in 2024, and that broader Baptist family is still known as the Southern Baptist Convention. Even though there have been attempts through the years to change it, it's just become so I guess, just so ingrained that they don't think, many people just don't think about it anymore. But if you're a brand new person who walks in and says, what denomination, and you're living in New York, and you say, well, I'm a Southern Baptist, well, that might be a little bit off-putting, so I'm assuming. But
they have opinions.
But nevertheless.
Someone who's ministered in the North.
On a lot of things.
Right? Yeah. So, but when it comes to communion, well, first of all, what I would say is the Lord's Supper, when it was established by Jesus, it was established with his disciples, his closest followers. When the Jews celebrated the Passover, which the Lord's Supper is derived from, it was for the Jews and for their understanding. Even the people that were brought in as proselytes were able to participate. And so the early church typically reserved, as best we can tell, the practice of the Lord's Supper for believers only. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the genesis theologically and historically for my understanding of the Lord's Supper, that is for believers. But then over time, one of the ways that people are acknowledged as members of a church is they're baptized. And so when I say that on a Sunday morning in that context, for our church members, what I'm saying to our people is, and I could bring more clarity to this if I needed to, but for our people, in our church, I'm talking about people who made the decision to follow Christ and then have been baptized as believers. Mm-hmm. But for the sake of the Lord's Supper, when I say a baptized person, it may be someone who was baptized as a Methodist or a Presbyterian or whatever. They may not have been baptized as a believer.
I don't think it needs more clarity.
So I'm just saying if you're baptized into a church family, then we would say you're welcome to take the Lord's Supper with us.
By the way, if you're not baptized, we could talk about it.
We can.
We have a long list of those that are in the queue.
So we don't practice open communion at our church. It's for believers. But we don't practice closed communion because it's not just for our own church members.
Yeah, there's a spectrum.
That's right.
We're somewhere in the middle.
I would say in my own church, though, growing up, when I was a teenager, my dad, along with a group of other men in the church, led a movement to abolish the closed communion practice. And it happened. And I'll never forget that. It was a fateful business meeting night. We had a town hall meeting and discussed it for several weeks. And our pastor taught some on it, from the scripture. And the pastor we had at the time was not a proponent of closed communion, but he knew that our church did it, so he didn't want to necessarily push the issue. But my dad and this group of men decided to do that. And I'll never forget, one of the questions was, well, if Billy Graham showed up tonight to take the Lord's Supper, would he be welcome? And one of the men in the church said, well, if he had joined our church that morning, he'd be welcome that night. And that kind of pushed the vote, because there were people in the room thinking, no, come on, man. Billy Graham, seriously. Mm-hmm. So we voted on a fateful night to abolish that. And my dad was in the middle of all that. So my teenage years, we changed that practice. And now we had a handful of church members that never took the Lord's Supper again,
Out of protest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, till they died. So, but I would say, to me, this is just like baptism for me is a practice for the church. I would say the Lord's Supper is as well, and that's why I would restrict it to people who are following Jesus. That'd be my take. So even though I disagree with infant baptism because I don't believe it's biblical, that's just my take. Obviously, I'm a Baptist. However, I do understand the covenant theology that lies underneath the practice of it, and infant baptism is something that's done by the church, on behalf of the church, in the church, for church families. And so that's why when it comes to the Lord's Supper, I would say that that's an acceptable practice, if you will, for someone to be eligible to receive the Lord's Supper in our church, even though that's not my theological conviction about baptism. Does that make sense? But it's not like this is just some random thing that somebody did. Well, now they're eligible for the Lord's Supper. No, they've done something in the church, through the church, by the church, on behalf of the church. So they're a part of the church family, if you will. So, but it's always to me, I think too, what we're doing now, as y'all know, we serve the Lord's Supper once a month. We don't do it every Sunday, but we've even had some conversations about, is that something that we need to think about offering the opportunity, every Sunday morning for people who would like to receive communion. I was at, the last time I was in New York, went to Pete Scazzero's church. He's not the pastor anymore. They have a new
Rich Lotus.
Yeah,
New Life Fellowship.
Yes,
New Life
that's
Fellowship.
Is it New Life? I think
so.
I think so.
Well, at the end of the
Queens.
service, they the pastor said something. I was there to meet with Pete, so I had a meeting with him after church. And so, the service that day, the pastor said something like this: We're going to make our way to Bible study, to fellowship. You may be going home, but as we go today, we have some folks at the front of the church who will be there to pray for you, pray with you, if that's what you would like. And for those of you, he said something like this, and I don't remember the exact phrase, but this is what I heard. For those of you who need communion, he said, you'll find ministers at the various exits. And so I just watched. I was there. I was just, visiting. So I was just watching. Well, I noticed a number of people went and got in line where these ministers were stationed, and they took the Lord's Supper right there, and then they made their way out. So I asked Pete about it later. He and I were talking about some other things. That's back when I was doing that study of emotionally healthy churches, emotional, if you remember all that.
Yeah, he wrote Emotionally Healthy Spirituality.
He wrote that whole series.
Because our people might have heard of that one.
Yeah.
It's pretty popular.
So we were just kind of joking at the beginning of our conversation, just talking about, well, you were new here today. What'd you notice and all that? And I said, well, I've never seen the drive-through communion before. And he started laughing. He said, well, I've never heard anybody call it that. I said, well, I thought it was interesting. I said, typical, when I think of communion, it's kind of a full body. Yeah.
And it's very central to the service.
Whatever. Yeah. But, and he said, well, to be honest with you, he said, our church is home to people. He said, we're in New York. We have people from all different kinds of denominational backgrounds. And for some of them, if you don't take communion, you've not been to church. Just in their mind and in their heart. That's just so much a part of what they do. He said, so we just decided as a compromise, we're not going to do communion every Sunday for the full body, but as an accommodation to our members that we know it is so vital to them, we offer it every Sunday. And he said, you can pretty much see it's a group, it's some of the same people every Sunday that take advantage of it, if you want to call it that. I thought that was kind of an interesting accommodation and thought,
right.
So
when you have a diverse body of people
right.
with different backgrounds, it is something to think about.
So, but it also speaks to, we would, trust me, I know on some issues, my take on the New Testament and the church and the tribe that I'm in terms of the Christian, the part of the Christian family I belong to, I'm in the minority. So, for example, believers' baptism by immersion. Well, we're in the overwhelming minority. I mean,
right.
We're the smaller branch of Christianity that baptizes by immersion.
Which we went super deep dive on that on some episode of this, which was fascinating.
It's back in the archives somewhere.
If people want to know more, because it was like, how do we get there when the New Testament has people baptized by immersion all over?
Correct.
Anyway, it's fascinating deep dive.
So we're in the minority, not serving the Lord's Supper every Sunday. We're in the overwhelming minority there because most of Christendom
does it every single Sunday.
Right, has communion every Sunday. And so
every worship event.
Yeah, that's right. Not just Sunday. You can go numerous times.
The remembrance.
So I realize that. So, and that's why some things when it comes to baptism, I hold that pretty firmly because I believe it's taught, modeled in the New Testament.
And I want to clarify, while you can take communion, Lord's Supper in our church, if you've been baptized as an infant, you can't be a church member without getting baptized by immersion.
That is correct. So I would hold that one much more firmly, believer's baptism. But when to do the Lord's Supper, how often to do the Lord's Supper? Well, I'm going to hold that pretty loosely because, we're not really commanded. We're just commanded to do it in remembrance of Jesus. So I'm not quite as adamant about that, if that makes sense. So
monthly is a good rhythm.
Yeah, and I think it's good for our people. It's a good reminder of who we are. We're called to this table as broken, sinful people, but redeemed people, and so I love that imagery. I think it's very powerful. So
I do too. Well, and as a parent, I appreciate that we do it once a month because then every single month in worship, I have an opportunity with my daughter to talk about what it means, what it is, why we do it. And it always brings up that conversation. So if you're a parent and you're listening, monthly Lord's Supper is such a tremendous opportunity to have a conversation with your child about what Jesus did and what Jesus does for us.
It
with really tangible
an object lesson for them.
Right.
Which is good for our kids. It's one of the reasons we brought the offering back. Not the only reason, but it's one of the reasons we brought the offering back because it's such a good object lesson for our kids.
awesome to me to see so many of our young parents now who help with the offering and their children walk with them.
And it just teaches them something.
There's a lot being modeled right there, I think, for us. So it's pretty awesome. Yeah.
Some of those things can feel almost clunky or disruptive to a service.
Yeah.
If you don't think about the why behind them, just be really thoughtful about it. Yeah. So, okay. Thank you for letting me talk about Lord's Supper because now we're 20 minutes in and I'd like to talk about the text. Luke has several notes in beautiful colors as always.
Luke's such a good note taker.
Luke and Kurt Grice, I'd say, are some of the best note takers.
Yeah.
Wow.
If you ever can,
high praise for me
high
to
praise,
be compared to Kurt.
Do you have as many colors as Kurt? Well, you're getting there.
Luke has the digital version of it.
True.
Kurt walks around with 4 different colored pens
Kurt
in his
Grice
pocket.
2.0.
I don't want to be Kurt carrying around a stack of.
That's a compliment right there.
I'll take that one to the bank.
Yeah, that's a double-edged sword is what that is. To be Kurt Grice 2.0. Yeah. By the way, we miss Kurt.
I know. We talked to him last night.
Did you?
I did.
I miss him.
Yeah.
I miss him.
Kurt, if you're listening.
He's still recovering. He's doing well.
Surely Kurt will listen. He's just sitting there.
Little by little.
Right, Kurt? Okay. We're talking about one of the covenants in Exodus.
That's right.
Which any covenant we need to stop and pay attention to because there ain't many of them, you know, and they're teaching us something about life with God. So I love this one for many reasons, but and then I want to kick it to you all Bible scholars over here. It's just any time where God says something like, if you do this, then you will be blessed and highly favored. And the people are all like, excellent, we got it. And then the next scene, it's like, we're going to go with the golden calf, you know, like it's.
What a fickle people we are.
I know, but it's this is real life, you know, and so it just if you just look at Exodus 19 in this scene, I mean, God is making some beautiful promises to His people, and the people are saying, I don't have it in front of me, but they say, we're going to do that.
We'll do this. Yeah.
We're going to do it.
Moses tells the elders tell the people, and everybody says, "Amen."
And everybody says, "Wow, like this is the life that we always wanted. Why wouldn't? Of course.
Right.
All we have to do is obey God, and we get all this." And
maybe fully, as he says.
Yeah, but they answer, yes, we're going to do it.
You know, and the whole idea of covenant, no, we don't, as I said Sunday morning, we don't talk much about covenants. And there are at least 5 of them in the Scripture, at least 5 covenants that to me kind of hold our theological understanding of how God is at work. You know, there are theories about covenants. When you look at full-blown covenant theologians, they will start with the Trinity, you know, and they'll say, well, there's a covenant between the Trinity that has to do with the grace of God and the redemption of God. Well, we don't know that necessarily, but that's their...
Some good theologizing.
Yeah, they're thinking through
but very
where to
abstract.
start. Yeah, and then there's a covenant with Adam.
That perhaps before time was
right.
The Trinity entered into some mutual covenant.
But in terms of, I would say my understanding of covenantal theology...
Tell us everything.
The first covenant is with Noah, the one of substance, Genesis 9, where God says, and you have 2 different types of covenants, probably more than in the ancient world, but at least 2. You know, the suzerain vassal covenant, where you've got like this superior and the one who's under the superior, and then the covenant is...
Okay, but can you tell me more about suzerain vassal?
Well, it just comes from the...
It's like ancient Mesopotamian kind of idea. So you have the suzerain or the suzerite, depends on how you want to talk about it, who's the superior in a relationship.
Listen, I'm just playing the everyman.
And then
the everyman here.
Yeah, which we have to remember that for most ancient Near Eastern cultures in Mesopotamia, which is where we get kind of the suzerain vassal, they were deities to the people. Right. So the king was deity. So you have that.
Superior, obviously. The vassal is the servant. You know?
Yeah.
And that covenant typically means or is describing a conditional covenant. In other words, the suzerain, the king, whoever says, if you do this and you do this and you do this, I will do this. And then the vassal says, okay. Yeah. And then there's what you would call, it has all different names, but we'll just say royal grant, maybe is a good way to put it, where the king says, I'm going to give this to you. I'm going to grant this to you.
We talked about those in terms of just conditional, unconditional.
Right. So, but they actually have names theologically.
Oh, sure. And I'm sure I learned that 10 years ago.
But anyway.
It's way back there.
This is what I remember.
So you look at the covenant that God has with Noah. Well, that's a royal grant covenant. God says, I'm not going to do this again. He doesn't say, if y'all will do this. He just says, I'm not going to destroy the world again by water. So put the rainbow in the sky. Then you have the covenant with Abraham, which is more in the traditional covenantal expression. Leave where you are, go to where I'll show you, I will bless you.
Get up and go.
So there's the condition. And then you have this one, in the book of Exodus, the Mosaic covenant, which is also a conditional, if you'll obey me fully. And, you've got to read a little bit more into Exodus and Leviticus to get the full import of the covenant. And then there's the one with David in 2 Samuel, which is, I would say, more of a royal grant kind of covenant, because he basically says your line's always going to be on the throne. And then there's the new covenant, which has a little bit of a combination, so to speak. Bless you, Katie, but you got to receive.
It's a new type of covenant.
It's a different kind of covenant, really. But it's the one the Lord has with us today. And so that's why I just wanted to say Sunday morning, when God, because it's interesting when he says this in Exodus 19, if you'll fully obey my covenant, well, they don't have one yet. So it's about to unfold in front of you. Then I will do this. But I
will be your God, you will be my people.
That's right. But what's cool about it is God contextualizes it by reminding them what he's already done. So he's worthy of this kind of affection and adoration. Look what he's already done. And now this entering into this relationship. And so I think if you think about in our culture, we deal more with contracts. And to me that makes it a little less than. That's what I usually tell couples when I'm talking to them about marrying them. In the state of Texas, you're going to have it's a contract. And that's particularly true in our state because we are a community property state. Okay. So, that means that if you're married, then everything you own is shared half, because it's, in other words, it's community. And that originally, I'm sure y'all know this, but originally that kind of legal practice was put in place to protect women because, there was a time when, as we all know, women couldn't even get a credit card.
It wasn't that long ago.
They couldn't get a loan from the bank.
We're talking about my mom, not my grandma.
Yeah, had to be co-signed with their husband. I think it was kind of interesting, but nevertheless, that's just the truth. Well, so the typical American family, the man's working, so when he goes to buy a house is in his name. When he goes to buy a car, the car's in his name. And so the wife, being a homemaker and a mom, well, you get divorced and everything is in the man's name and there's nothing for the woman unless you depend on the man's generosity. And most divorced people are not the most generous people in the world. Let's just be honest. When they're getting a divorce, Right. So states like Texas have this community property law, which says mainly it was put in place to protect her. Mm-hmm. Well, okay. It doesn't matter. You buy the house as a married couple. If you're married, when you have that home, it's y'all's, so this is a legal contract, but we're Christians. So what I tell couples is we're not just kind of formalizing a contract.
The contract is legal. A covenant is relational.
Yeah. We're entering into a covenantal relationship that has the biblical overtones, and it's to mimic or reflect the relationship God has with us. So it's much deeper. It's kind of like, I get, when our kid, well, y'all's kids are little. As they get older, think about it. When they start driving or they come of a certain age, you're still responsible for them. So you have a legal contract in the state of Texas with them. Okay. So if they do something, you're going to be obligated to do something about it. But y'all both know you don't have a legal contract with your children. That's not what you think of. No. You have a deep relationship with your children that is covenantal
and there's really
in nature. It is what it is. So that's kind of what I would like for our people to embrace and understand. The relationship we have with God, it's covenantal in nature. It is highly relational, and it's rooted in God's generosity and God's grace and what God's already done for us, and what he is doing for us and what he will do for us. And our connection to it is obedience. That's what I would say. And living fully into it and enjoying it in its fullest measure. And so God's going to give expectations. We're going to talk about this coming Sunday. Why did God give the 10 Commandments? Why did God say to Moses, okay, here's how I'm going to define this relationship? Well, if you think about it, they had no definition of the relationship yet. What were they supposed to do? Okay, they've just been delivered out of Egypt. Who are they? Well, they're children of Abraham. Okay, but what's expected of them? If this God's going to bless them, and so God begins giving them these basic. One of my professors in seminary used to say, you start with the 10 Commandments, you're in kindergarten. You just, okay, look both ways before you cross the street. He said this respectfully, but you know what I mean? Don't hit your neighbor. I mean, in other words, here are just some core things that I'm going to require of you if you're going to be mine. That this is how you will look to the ancient world. And so, and if you go back and study, you know, as we've done when you're in seminary, you study these ancient peoples. If you live by the 10 Commandments in the ancient world, you would stand out. You know, no graven images. You know, so think about the Canaanites. Show us your God. Where's your God? Here's our God. Well, we don't do that. Oh, okay. Interesting.
Weird.
Yeah, exactly. And so where is your God? You know, where do you, even in those early days, think about where do you even go to worship him? You know, and so if they're going to live by these commands, and then on top of that, you get all these ethical demands that you have for the life of Israel, you know, throughout the rest of the law. Well, this was truly a defining moment for Israel. This is where the people of God come into being, really. That's why it's so pivotal to me to continue to read these texts, because God is showing us, I have expectations of you that if you're going to be mine, this is how you'll live. You know?
And if you're tempted to gloss over those portions of the Bible, I think as we are all prone to do, I don't know anyone I know a few people, but they're odd, who say Leviticus is their favorite book.
That's right. They're probably doing it for
but there are a lot of Old Testament scholars who will say Leviticus 15, which I'm pretty sure is the passage about Jubilee. Now I'm doubting myself.
No, I think that's right.
I think it's right.
I can fact check. You keep going.
Would say that that's actually the heart and soul of all of the Old Testament law. So while we're focused on the 10 Commandments, which is basic behavioral, is it Jubilee?
Well, the title is not helpful.
Maybe 25.
It's not making me feel good.
Maybe it's 25.
I don't even want to quote
Somewhere in
it.
Leviticus.
Someone is
I don't even want to
now.
say it out loud on this podcast.
Can I just claim that I'm not a Leviticus expert? But
very
the
humble
passage
of
is
you.
about Jubilee, which might be
I actually have my
25.
Bible. Yeah.
I have my iPad that I can turn to. But they'll say this is the heart and soul. So while the 10 Commandments are these basic behavioral things, there is Leviticus 25 is actually the heart of this. This is the kind of people you are to become.
Just FYI, 15 is crazy.
15 is crazy. Go read 25.
I can't even read it out loud on here.
Go read 25 instead. My bad, y'all.
15 would be a good fun thing to do today, though. But yeah.
Do you want me it would derail us completely.
This
Anyway.
whole
Let's not go there.
idea, though, about celebration, ownership, acknowledging God's ownership of everything you have, just his lordship over your life. I mean, the beauty of all of that, and it's in an Old Testament context. That's what's interesting to me, you know, that because people think, well, the God of the Old Testament must have changed, you know, when you get to the New Testament. Well, that's just really not true. It's just our ability to understand him and truly grasp his full revelation. It's a journey of understanding the revelation of God.
It is.
It's not a journey of God changing.
But redemption is baked into the plan from the get-go.
It is.
And I think
which is beautiful.
It is.
And the whole story of Exodus, I mean, I love the fact that you think about how important this is to God, because I don't know what these people were thinking when they leave Egypt. This is what I think they're thinking. I could be wrong. But I know I'm very destination focused as a person. I'm thinking, okay, we've been set free from Egypt. We are going to the land that God gave to Abraham. That's what we've been told. And what is it, a 2-week journey, maybe 3-week journey? I'm guessing, you know, from Egypt to Israel-ish. And you get to Mount Sinai, and God makes them stay there for a year almost. Well, that first of all, how disappointing if you're like me. You're thinking, I would get up every morning and say, so are we leaving today? When are we going? Well, but what God is saying is, you can't go until you know who you are and who I am. Why would you go? Why would I put you in the land of all the ites when you have no idea who you are, and you certainly don't understand who I am? So that's why it shows you how seriously God's taken all this. He makes them stay there at Mount Sinai for 10 or 11 months just so they can come to an understanding of who they are and who he is. That's why this material is so important, and it's so woven into the fabric of Orthodox Jews even today. You know, the book of the law is something they pay attention to every single day. You know, it's not something they look at casually every once in a while. Now, the secular Jews, you know, it's just not, it doesn't mean anything to them.
Yeah, it's different.
But and I say that respectfully. But Orthodox Jews, this is the very heart of who they are. This is where God has revealed himself to them, and God has delivered them in a miraculous way. That's why this story is so powerful to me. And that's why I love Jesus takes this into his own ministry. He is going to incorporate so much of this imagery into who he is as the Messiah. And all the Jewish people who are paying attention would recognize it. We're going to, I was talking to the worship team yesterday, we're going to start Mark in the summer. Well, there's reason there for me because, first of all, I love Mark's gospel, but we're studying the Exodus, and Mark starts his gospel with Jesus in the wilderness for 40 days. I mean, right off the bat, Mark is letting you know that, this Exodus story and Exodus imagery. And plus, by that time, the Jews associated the wilderness with God's revelation of himself, with God's deliverance, with God's provision. And so all that imagery is in the opening of Mark's gospel. And so this story, it's hard to exaggerate the import of the story, in my opinion, the story of the Exodus. It just captures the imagination of these people. But then this new covenant, that's also a whole other conversation, because now Peter, after hearing Jesus and understanding who Jesus is, where Jesus says, this is the blood of the new covenant, then Peter takes all that imagery and places it squarely on the church to show us the church now. We're the new covenantal people of God. This is where God's at work now. And so all of this that's led up to this is preparatory, powerful, important. The oracles of God, the story of redemption, all being shepherded and stewarded by the children of Abraham. But now Paul and Peter both. Paul will argue we are the children of Abraham. Peter will say we're the chosen people now. So just this whole expression of the new covenant in what I would consider the age to come, the inaugurated eschatology, we are now the people of God living into these commands. And so that's why it's important for us to understand who we've always been. So when you talk about the Ten Commandments, people say, I don't think Ten Commandments apply to us anymore. Well, Jesus has fulfilled the law, true. But if you understand God's calling on us to be separate and holy people, that's why we go back to things like the Ten Commandments. Right. That God's told us you're going to look differently. You're going to act differently than the world around you. And because you're reflecting me, you can't make an image of me because my image is in you. So you're reflecting me in this world. So we have to take that seriously. So
we do.
Anyway, so this Sunday, I'm going to preach on the Ten Commandments. Mother's Day, I've titled the sermon, Rules are Rules. Moms are really good at here are the rules of the house. What my mom was, because my mom enforced those rules because she was with us more when we were kids, And so Daddy was the one that came in, to kind of, if there was just a problem that just got out of hand. But very rarely did that happen because
you don't want to see your dad come.
No, my mom was pretty good at handling it, trust me. Yeah. And so I thought it's a good thing to talk about on Mother's Day, that role that moms play and that we have in our homes where we learn these rules, because that's where the Jews taught them. And we augment them and we bless them here at the church. But it's another word on Sunday morning to our parents. This is your job. So I'm saying that to you too. This is your job. I love your children, and I want to do everything I can to bless y'all's children and help them have everything they need spiritually. But at the end of the day, that's your role. You're the one that's with them every night, putting them to bed and having those conversations like you just said, and I get to come in and bless and encourage, but the heart of it happens with y'all. So anyway, but we'll save that for Sunday.
Yes.
Well, you gave them a sneak peek for our faithful listeners.
It's going to be a good Sunday.
Yeah,
good.
I'm excited about it.
So, well, that is...
There's much more we could talk about, but I think...
Keep going and going.
I do want to say we are working on Tell Me More Live for our 100th episode.
That's right.
But summer's busy and we're having trouble nailing it down. So we're hoping on the...
Stay tuned.
Well, Sunday night the 23rd is what it's looking like.
Yeah.
But that's not official because
stay tuned.
We don't think Luke can be there.
Yeah.
Sorry, y'all.
But even if Luke's not there, we're going to somehow
I'll make a plan.
logically bring him there.
Anyway, for those that made it to the last second, you get it. You get some insider info. So,
sorry to close without a song from D-Dub, but it's okay.
Is it too?
It's too late.
It's not too late.
You can always sing the doxology.
No, it's too late.
Okay.
It's okay.
So
well, thanks for listening.
Thank you all.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
See you next week.
Bye.
for listening to the Tell Me More podcast today. You can subscribe to this podcast on your app of choice, or you can visit us at fbca.org to find out more information about the podcast and our church. Thanks for listening. Have a good day.